Producer surplus is the extra benefit sellers receive when the market price is higher than the minimum they were willing to accept. A farmer willing to sell apples for $2 but receiving $3 gains surplus on each sale. The concept shows why market price can create gains for producers. Producer surplus appears when a seller receives more than the minimum amount needed to supply the product. A freelancer may accept a lower rate during a slow month but demand more when fully booked. The seller's minimum acceptable price is shaped by costs, effort, risk, and alternatives. Surplus cannot be understood without knowing the seller's floor. A farmer who would sell at $3 but receives $5 keeps the extra $2 as surplus. Market price is the amount buyers actually pay. In everyday life, if many buyers compete for the same product, the price may rise above what some sellers needed. The gap between price and minimum willingness is where surplus appears. The lowest acceptable price depends on costs, effort, risk, and the next best use of resources. A supply curve can be read as a line of sellers with different costs. Producer surplus is larger for sellers whose costs sit well below the market price. Low-cost producers are willing to sell earlier, while higher-cost producers need a higher price. When market prices rise, some producers gain even if their physical output does not change. Profit subtracts all business costs, while producer surplus focuses on the difference between price and willingness to sell. They are related, but they are not identical. This is not the same as profit. Surplus is not the same as total profit, because firms still have fixed costs, taxes, wages, and debt. A simple market stall makes the idea visible. One vendor can make bread cheaply and would accept $4, but the market price is $6. That is why that extra $2 represents producer surplus before broader accounting details. A seller with lower costs keeps more surplus at the same market price than a seller struggling with high costs. Cost reduction changes the seller's position in the market. Technology can increase producer surplus by lowering costs. A factory that produces each item more efficiently can earn more surplus at the same selling price. The concept helps explain why suppliers enter a market when prices improve and leave when margins disappear. Producer surplus can fall when input costs rise. If fuel, rent, wages, or raw materials become more expensive, the minimum acceptable price moves upward. Even a stable market price may become less attractive. Producer surplus grows when the market price rises but production costs stay stable. When many sellers offer similar products, buyers have more alternatives and prices may be pushed down. Competition affects how much surplus sellers keep. A crowded market can reduce the gap between price and cost. A seller's willingness to accept a price can change after fuel, rent, labor, or raw materials become expensive. Brand power can protect surplus. That willingness to pay can keep market price above the seller's minimum. A customer may pay more for a trusted name, reliable service, or unique design. Producer surplus shows how market prices reward some sellers more than others. Taxes can reduce producer surplus depending on who bears the burden. If a tax forces sellers to receive less after each sale, the gap shrinks. The impact depends on how buyers and sellers respond to the higher total price. If fuel or labor costs jump, the seller's surplus can shrink even when the selling price looks high. A government payment for producing renewable energy can make a project profitable at a lower market price. Policy can change the reward structure for sellers. Subsidies can increase surplus for some producers. A higher price helps producers most when their costs have not risen just as quickly. Shortages may raise producer surplus for sellers who still have supply. If demand jumps and inventory is limited, the market price may climb quickly. That benefit can be controversial when buyers feel squeezed. The concept helps explain why some firms expand while others exit the same market. High surplus attracts competition over time. If the expected price is well above the minimum needed, new producers see an opportunity. Surplus also helps explain why sellers enter markets. A high price does not automatically mean a producer is doing well if the cost of supply has risen too. A mistake is assuming every seller gains equally. The efficient farm may enjoy more surplus than the farm struggling with expensive inputs. Two farms selling at the same price may have very different costs. Farmers, manufacturers, and freelancers all compare the payment offered with the cost of supplying the work. A crop bumper harvest may flood the market and push prices below what many farmers expected. Producer surplus can disappear when prices fall suddenly. The same product can become much less rewarding in a different supply situation. A seller with lower costs keeps more surplus at the same market price than a seller struggling with high costs. The idea connects to negotiation. A seller with low costs has more room to discount while still gaining from the deal. Understanding the floor explains why some sellers can be flexible and others cannot. The distance between cost and price is where producer surplus becomes visible. That hidden gap is why market outcomes can look simple but contain many private calculations. Buyers do not usually see producer surplus directly. They see the final price, not the seller's minimum acceptable amount. Producer surplus grows when the market price rises but production costs stay stable. For business owners, the practical question is how to widen the gap honestly. Lower costs, stronger quality, better positioning, or unique value can increase surplus without tricking buyers. The healthiest surplus comes from real efficiency or real value. Market changes matter because they move that distance wider or narrower. When sellers receive more than the minimum they required, the transaction benefits them beyond merely covering the floor. Producer surplus explains one side of the gains from trade. Together with consumer surplus, it shows why voluntary exchange can create value for both sides. A seller with lower costs keeps more surplus at the same market price than a seller struggling with high costs. In producer surplus, ask who pays, who benefits, who adjusts behavior, and what changes when the price or rule moves. Producer surplus becomes useful when it explains an actual market choice rather than a memorized definition. Producer surplus grows when the market price rises but production costs stay stable. If fuel or labor costs jump, the seller's surplus can shrink even when the selling price looks high. The concept helps explain why some firms expand while others exit the same market. If fuel or labor costs jump, the seller's surplus can shrink even when the selling price looks high. Producer surplus also explains why sellers react differently to the same price. One supplier may have efficient equipment, low rent, and stable labor costs, while another faces expensive inputs and thin margins. The market price is identical for both, but the surplus is not. That is why supply decisions cannot be understood from the selling price alone.